Welcome everybody, it's Rev. We're doing another game theory slash math video. This one may be a little bit more forced just because it was at special request of this guy right here. Um, if you don't know who this is, his name is Ivan Rosito, and he just wanted something to wet his whistle for some game theory and math. So I want to go over really how, uh, and maybe not to settle a debate, but at least maybe have a mathematical framework for a debate that rages within the War League community, specifically GOATs, about War League lineups with all Chaos Turbo teams versus diversified teams. So by that I mean all Chaos Turbo teams being, solitaire more or less. You only play Chaos Turbo. 5 players load Chaos Turbo because it's the best deck each and every week, and that's going to give you the best chance to win the league or make playoffs, whatever you're looking for. Or the other school of thought, which is you should represent a diversified lineup of maybe a lot of Chaos Turbo, but some Warrior as well, or maybe some Control, or maybe even Burn, or I don't know, something else that is decent. Um, so the reason I kind of wanted to draw this analogy to, I guess, a different formula is because I think it's a pretty clean way to look at it. Not that it necessarily solves anything, just because I think it's more complex than that. But this is more or less the formula that I want to focus on, and this is a graph or representation of part of this formula. So we'll talk about what I'm talking about here in a second. But the big debate being whether or not it's best to just play 5 straight of the best deck or represent a diversified portfolio or a diversified lineup of decks. You can see where I'm going with this with portfolio. And the reason for this is, I, as a hobby, do a decent amount of investing. So there's just a lot you read, and sometimes you draw conclusions and cross different lines on, the gaming side versus the investing side. I also would say if you do like games, investing is definitely a good game to play. Not only can you make money with it, but it's very democratic and fair, depending on, I guess, what type of investing you're doing. So uh, let's jump right into it. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about this with GOAT format, which is, let's say, a diversified lineup of players in War League. That being like maybe 1 Warrior, let's say 2 Chaos or 3 Chaos, and like a Chaos Control or something. Um, because I think where people make mistakes is they don't realize when it's just one player going into a tournament alone, there are different dynamics at play than 5 versus 5 whenever you're playing a game. And that kind of gets into like the investing side of things, which is a single asset is going to perform differently than if it's, in a portfolio of different assets alongside it. So let's just jump right into this. So um, we're gonna, I guess, start off with kind of the backbone of this theory, which is modern portfolio theory, which is, Harry Markowitz mathematically basically proved this little chart here, and it was pretty revolutionary for the time. I think he won like a Nobel Prize for it or something. Um, and basically, what it says is that in a portfolio of investment assets, and just this is hyper simplified, just stocks and bonds. There's other stuff out there, of course, but in just stocks and bonds, in a diversified portfolio of both assets, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I want to repeat that because that's really the whole crux of this video, which is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which basically means 1 plus 1 equals 3 in some cases, or 1 plus 1 equals 2.5, whatever you want to say. Um, and where this starts is, let's say you had a portfolio of 100% stocks here. So 100% stocks are riskier, they have greater returns. So let's say you get an expected return of like 11-ish% here. Your risk is 17. Maybe some people aren't really willing to take that much risk, so they start adding bonds. Or let's look at somebody else who's, maybe a little bit more timid. They have 100% in bonds, so they get a much lower return, somewhere around 5, and their risk level is 11. So as you can see, like with this chart, you kind of just line them up with the X and Y axis. And for the longest time, people thought that if you for instance, were at 100% stocks and you reduced some of that to buy bonds, it would be a step function linearly, and that's going to be a recurring theme in a lot of these videos, which is that it's a linear relationship when it's not. A lot of things move exponentially or on curves like this. But if you moved a little bit out of stocks and you move towards bonds, you'd move here. But what ended up actually happening is you move out here. And they'd say if you, let's say you moved 50% stocks, 50% bonds, you would expect the line to follow my mouse here. It'd just be a straight line like this. And what you're maximizing for is the highest amount of return per unit of risk. So you want a lot of money for no risk. That's of course fairy tale land, but you're trying to optimize around that. So what Harry Markowitz found was that it doesn't move in a straight line. And what people thought for a very long time was 50% stocks, 50% bonds would put you right here. They thought, hey, 50% stocks, you'll get a risk level of, let's say, 13%, and your return's going to be about 7%. But he mathematically and empirically proved that it actually puts you here, which means you get a risk level that's quite a bit less. So let's call it 11.5%, but you get about the same return, if not maybe a little bit more. So that's the whole thing, which is that the two assets basically didn't move as a step function linearly. And this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I do think that this has some implications for War League lineups, because War League lineups do function similarly to a portfolio of assets because it's multiple players playing multiple decks with different weaknesses and different strengths. And the risk part of this equation is basically empirically proven here. I don't want to get into too much of like what this is because it gets a little hairy. If you want to read up on it, I mean, this will kind of tell you everything that you need to know. But what people thought for the longest time was that it was like if you were looking to model the risk of a portfolio, it was just this first part, like to the left of my mouse, that you'd look at. What they proved later on is that you need to add this for it to actually line up on what the portfolio risk is. So the idea here is, let's say that in Edison format, oh no, let's just say in Edison format, you think Blackwings is the best deck, and you decide to play all Blackwings, and you go into a tournament. You might do well because Blackwings are a really good deck. But in War League, let's say you think Blackwings is the best deck, and all 5 of your teammates each and every single week run Blackwings. Well, what happens? Your opponents are going to start maining Consecrated Light because they can. They're going to start running Lightsworn, Hero Beat with main Consecrated Lights, and you're going to have a much more difficult time. Let's say you do something a little bit more intelligent. You say, hey, I think Blackwings are a good deck. I think Vayu is a good deck, and I think Frogs are a good deck. I don't want to get preed, so each and every week, maybe we run, I'm just pulling these numbers out, but 2 Blackwings, 2 Vayu, and a Frog variant, or maybe some weeks we do 2 Frogs, 1 Vayu, 2 Blackwing, whatever it is. What this accomplishes is a few things. First, it helps reduce pre. So if opponents can just mercilessly pre you whenever you want and build a side deck completely tailored around beating your specific deck, that's no good. So you'll see, especially in Edison War League, almost all teams bring a very diversified lineup. That doesn't mean they don't favor Blackwings. Some teams heavily favor Vayu. There are Frog teams out there as well. And why this works is, again, for a few reasons. It helps reduce pre. It requires your opponent to utilize their flex spots more strictly. So even if it's not is something like heinous pre, like a Consecrated Light, like you could think about like even just how your trap lineup would be adjusted if you knew you were never going to need to face anything other than frogs. I mean, like you'd pretty much just always like not play bottomless or something like that. I don't know exactly like what it is, or you'd like just not have heavy storm like in your main deck or something. Same things go with goat format. So if each and every week you 100% know that, let's just say, let's actually just do 100%. I was going to say 90%, but let's just say it's 100% of the time you're going to be going up against a solitaire Chaos Turbo list. I think that's somewhat exploitable. You could main deck Minecons. You could adjust your lineup to play warriors. You could make sure you're maximizing shoots rather than having that question in the back of your mind. Maybe you start cutting torrentials. Um, Kaiku might come into the main. So really, the sort of crux of the short before we get into the math portion of it is that you playing a diversified lineup makes your lineup stronger than just the sum of its parts, because your chaos players help your warrior players not get preed, and your warrior players help your chaos players not get preed. They both take up different parts of the side space, especially in Edison. If your team doesn't represent frogs, think about how much side space that frees up for the opposing team. If your team never represented frogs, you never need to have rugs. Maybe never Mask of Restrict. Oppressions maybe could even come out. I don't know. Dynas maybe come out. Like, think about how much side space that frees up for the entire lineup if you're not representing frogs. And same with like value. Like, if then they just don't need to have crows in their side deck. Same with like Blackwings. So I guess I can cut those dust tornadoes out of my side deck. So that's the idea. And really it kind of boils down to this formula, which was that originally people thought that a portfolio of assets, and we'll try to cross the bridge saying a portfolio of War League players was just these two, um, I guess, sub functions of this formula. Um, but what it ended up being was this. And I'll go through each little bit of notation here to talk about why I think it is closer to this and not just the first two parts. So in a portfolio, the risk is defined as the weight of asset one squared, the variance of asset one times the variance of asset one plus the weight of asset two times the variance of asset two. What the innovative thing was adding this second portion here, which is that you actually add two times weight of asset number one times weight of asset number two times the correlation. This is the most important part. The correlation of between the assets, and then the standard deviation of asset one and the standard deviation of asset two. So why this is important is that if assets have, let's say, a negative covariance, this whole number becomes smaller. So let's just plug in numbers. Let's just say um, w squared times variance squared here equals 1, and then uh, w sub 2 squared times variance sub 2 squared equals 2. Let's just say we were just looking at the first port of that, so 1 plus 2 equals 3. But let's say we plug a correlation coefficient in here of a negative number. That suddenly means that this doesn't equal 3 anymore. Well, I mean, let's just ignore the square root, but let's just say it's not 3. It becomes smaller. It gets down to 2.5 or 2. So what that means is when you combine assets that have negative correlations, it makes the portfolio of assets stronger. And the line I'm trying to draw here is that when you combine a group of decks that have negative correlations, the group as a whole gets stronger. So Warriors have different weaknesses than Chaos Turbo. So therefore, I would say they probably have a negative correlation. If you're going to be preying for Warrior, or you're going to be building a main deck or side deck for Warrior, it's going to be very different looking than what you'd build for Chaos Turbo. I'd say they have a negative correlation. What does this mean if you had a portfolio, we'll call it, of 5 War League players? It means if you have negative correlations, what happens? You get moved on this axis as opposed to a straight line. So it means you still get, expected quote unquote returns, or I guess we'll say that's expected win rates, but you lower the overall risk of pre. So that's really all I'm trying to draw here. I know it's very abstract, but um, that's what it is. I just think that it's better to think of War League groups as a portfolio as opposed to looking at them as a standalone. I'm not really sure how much longer I can go on about this. That's going to be it. Thanks.